Hello, I'm Robin Gibson and this is the Harvard House Money Morsel. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us again. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell so that you get a notification of when we're releasing a new video. I'm sitting today with Willie Pelser. Morning, Willie.
Hello, Robin.
So, Willie, we don't know what's going on in the world. So last week it was all, we can't get a ship through the Strait of Hormuz. And I think the whole of last week we had Mr. Trump going, I'm going to blow these guys back to the Dark Ages, or the Stone Age, I think was his term. And they denied that they were meeting. And all of a sudden we had 2-week peace plan. Markets shot the lights out, didn't they?
Yeah, well, Robin, I think that's, as we've said this year, the volatility will remain. I think the critical question is how long will the ceasefire last? They
Yes.
did say this is a 2-week type of thing, but as one reflects on these things, I took myself back to the Ukraine and the Russian war.
Yes.
And Trump was also in the midst of that and said, tomorrow the war will end. How many times has he said that? I think the times we live in, especially around wars at the moment, it's the difficulty is to pinpoint the start date, and no one knows the end date.
Yes.
And I think we're fighting a bigger war in principle than just the physical around it. So the concern, the fact that the markets rally is every time there's a bit of a respite or relief that there's an opportunity for this to end.
Yes.
That's how markets work. They
Yeah.
will rally. And we mustn't forget, people are looking for the next quick buck to make.
Yes.
When you see the share movements and the market movements in percentage terms,
Yes.
that's the relief type of thing. The concern, I think, overall is, what's the next move if the ceasefire date approaches us?
Yes.
And they say, no, it's back to square one.
Yes.
We're closing the strait and we're not moving forward. I think that's what the market, the day thereafter, even in our market, you see the shares sold off again type of thing, because we don't have answers on the what ifs. I think, Robin, for me, the other thing I constantly look at is you try and pick up what's happening behind the scenes. And there's quite a few political analysts and old school people, if I can call it that way, that I read and listen to, and they say there are things happening behind the scenes. And there's diplomatic forces. There's other people you and I don't know. We don't know their names. We don't know who they are.
Yeah.
They're sitting in the Zoom rooms or in the different war rooms, and they try to get a solution to this.
Yeah.
And that's what we're waiting for. So uncertainty. As soon as something happens, the markets will rally and then they will collapse. It's not collapse, they will retrace.
So, I mean, we did see that Israel said Lebanon was excluded. Iran said Lebanon is included. Israel continued to hit Lebanon.
Yep.
And so there was some question about, how tight is this ceasefire? But the markets didn't fall nearly as much as they might have. Willie, is to some extent this because the question mark up to this point is how much is Iran prepared to negotiate? And now what's clear is they are prepared to negotiate and there could be a diplomatic. So they weren't as pessimistic in terms of when the ceasefire looked shaky.
Yeah, Robin, I think there is some truth in it because, again, I'm looking at it very simplistically, is their only substantial source of income is actually oil. So if Trump and he finds a few allies and so on, and they do hit their infrastructure big time, that country's got a problem. So I think they again in the background, I think they realize that we have to come to some form of solution. The solution is not going to bring oil price specifically back to, call it the $60 level, because again, there's an entrenched bigger war around. We spoke about it, the change in the world order, potential in the change in energy and so on. But I think, the second tier, third tier Iranian leaders are behind the scenes really looking for some form of solution.
Yes.
And they've got other friends, if I
Yes.
can call it that way. So
Yeah.
to close the strait full time, China's got a problem. China will step in, I'm not saying they will step in with artillery, but they will step in and say, whoa, help us. We need this. We've mentioned other countries around that rely on that. So in a sense, there's lots of hope that it will happen. Again, if I go back to the war around Ukraine and Russia, it's still in the making. It's still there. So I think this is also, we'll stand back in a year's time and still talk about it.
And what will become definitely clear over time, Willie, is that events like these become catalysts for something else. Business doesn't just sit still.
No.
They go, we've got to find an alternative. We've got to look at another way of getting that, or whatever it is.
Robin, and I think there's a few constitutions that's going to change. And I think entities like NATO, all of these pacts that's been formed historically, I think there's going to be changes in that as well, because NATO is sort of a peace force principle. They're not they're not proactive, they're reactive. And Trump wants them to be on his side. So I think all of those things, at the end of the day, there will be negotiations around that. And as you say, from a company perspective, just again looking at a few companies we have in client portfolios, you can see how forces are changing.
Yes.
And their sources are changing. There's a big talk again in South Africa as to, where's our agricultural exports going to, given this.
So just the final point I wanted to ask is that some of the reaction to the sort of ceasefire, and I'm talking particularly from a South African point of view, I mean, the rand just absolutely came back. I mean, that does speak to the fact that underlying what's happening internationally, things are a lot better from a foundational point of view in South Africa, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely, Robin. And the reaction on the currency is effectively just the oil and what's happening on the petrol price.
Yes.
It's and that's the immediate reaction. But we wouldn't have been in a position to survive, the financial implications of this thing if it wasn't for the Monetary Policy Committee and if it wasn't for National Treasury.
Yes.
We've done, despite everything, we've put in place some incredible milestones going back.
Well, it's great to hear not everything is broken in South Africa. Willie, thanks for your time and your insights. I know you've got a busy schedule. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.